thank you to everyone who has joined. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to today's online session. And we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. So we're going to be telling the story of a third-party incident from two different perspectives, um, both the risk management side and the SOC side. And while third-party breaches are becoming more common, it's actually quite rare for these two groups to be fully coordinated and to come together in the lead up to, during, and post breach, which is exactly what you'll see as we walk through this particular scenario today. And although the scenario itself it is overall hypothetical, it is based on a number of incidents and breaches that both Andy and Haydn have been involved with. So we're going to cover what actually happens when a supply breach lands on your doorstep, including the build up to the fallout and the aftermath. And we'll also be showing you a different perspective. So how things could have played out if these two teams had been aligned. So kind of what should have happened. By the end of the session, you'll have practical steps that you can take back to your team immediately to reduce impact, lessen confusion, and to stop repeat incidents. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our two experts for today's session. We have Haydn Brooks, who is CEO of RiskLedger, and also Andy Papastefanou, who is the CEO and founder of Talanos. Both of these people have vast experience of working with companies to help reduce the risk introduced by third-party incidents, and they both bring a unique perspective to today's discussion. So Haydn, I'm going to pass over to you to do a brief introduction, if that's okay, while I fix my
Absolutely
slide
fine.
issue.
Cool. Well, nice to meet everyone. I can see a few names that I recognize on the attendee list, so nice to see you all here. Brief introduction on myself. Studied neuroscience at university, ended up joining a Big Four consulting firm where they placed me in their cyber risk team. So that was the start of my career in cyber. Spent about 3 years kind of covering projects in many different domains within security, but ended up specializing within supply chain risk. So I helped set up and run a lot of the third-party risk management processes that particularly a lot of the banks have across London. Off the back of that, I founded RiskLedger to solve a few of the challenges that all of the clients I was working with as a consultant were having when they were looking at supply chain risk, particularly from a security point of view. So since then, yeah, RiskLedger is now approaching Series B. We're 70 people and over 180 kind of public sector and private sector clients. And the entire kind of ethos behind the company is trying to do supply chain risk very well, but also opening up these new capabilities around detection and response within the supply chain. But yeah, nice to see you all. I think I might be handing over to
Great.
Andy now.
Yes.
Hello, everybody. I am Andy Papastefanou, founder and CEO of the Talanos Cybersecurity Group, based in South Africa, India, and the UK. Our primary service offering is in SOC building. I've got 10 years of building SOCs for large financial services, critical national infrastructure, manufacturing businesses, large consulting. And a big area of focus these days is adding third-party risk management to the overall mix of services that we provide. My personal interests are in active defense strategies. So this is the gray zone that is between defensive and sort of waiting to be attacked and hacking back, which is just slightly more aggressive than offensive security. It's sort of a legal gray zone of the things that you can do to proactively defend yourself against attackers. And I also look after a program in the NCSC as part of the I-100 volunteer program called the Incident Insights Program. So these are lessons learned from within various public and private sector SOC businesses uh, and sharing lessons learned about incidents that were suffered across those groups of customers. so that basically everyone has learnt from those issues and they don't suffer from those same incidents again. Um, Natasha's still wrangling the slides here. It looks like they've got a life of their own. The first one that I sort of wanted to bring up here was the cybersecurity maturity journey that most businesses will find themselves on. Now, if only it was a linear picture like the one that was up there, which was sort of that S curve that started from really basic controls, essentially the things that the UK government have said, if you want to protect yourself as a business in the UK, you've got to get these couple of hygiene controls right. These are things like enabling MFA, making sure that your users aren't interacting with their machines using local admin, so that they're not privileged accounts that can basically install any malicious software on the machine. And so these basic controls form part of the Cyber Essentials plan in the UK that people can get certified against. Uh, but then beyond that is where people really start understanding, well, how can they refine their risk? They're interested in understanding how their business might be attacked and the things that might impact their business heavily. And that means selecting a different set of controls unique to each business to make sure that their risk is effectively managed. And that's sort of in that intermediate stage. And then on the advanced stage is really where you get into some of the active defense things that I mentioned, not quite hacking back, but using threat intelligence to proactively make sure that you are protected. So where does third-party risk management fit along that S curve? And we had a bit of a discussion in the preparation for this call yesterday between Hayden and myself. Actually, people have been doing third-party risk management in some shape or form long before it became a cyber thing. It's on the next slide, please, Natasha. Um, Essentially, as part of onboarding suppliers as a checkbox exercise, supply chain management have been checking the financial stability of businesses that they work with. They've been checking perhaps their environmental credentials if they're a manufacturing company. They'd be checking whether they have good HR policies in place that those businesses aren't using child labor in the manufacture of some of the parts that they're using. So for a very long time, this has been sort of a compliance exercise as part of supplier onboarding. But really what's happened, and it follows almost that same S curve that I've got here of the cybersecurity capabilities, um, the focus switches towards resilience, actually. So when you're looking at your supply chain, they're sort of so important to your own business that if something were to happen to them, how does this affect your own resilience and what risks does this create? So that's where, from a cybersecurity perspective, these things kind of come together and it matures into a proper third-party risk management program. Because as the risk has developed over the years from a cybersecurity perspective, so the focus has become how do we keep ourselves resilient in the face of losing particular suppliers. And this led to an interesting thought experiment, which I'll let Hayden introduce on the next slide, really about how security operations and third-party risk management might overlap.
Cool. I'm just really enjoying in the background the slides jumping between back and forth. Cool. Thank you, Andy. Yeah. So basically, the idea essentially was that in a previous life, when I was working within supply chain risk teams, oftentimes we didn't even know the names of kind of our colleagues who actually worked in the SOC, let alone spoke with them maybe as often as we should. So Andy and I met and we were having a conversation, and one of the big things that Risk Ledger are moving towards is essentially opening up these new capabilities around detection and response in the supply chain. And that sparked an interesting conversation around, well, if we thought about previous breaches that we've worked on, how could the SOC and the supply chain teams have worked better together, either to better prepare for a supply chain incident and try and prevent it from happening, or to better prepare us so that we were able to respond to that incident in a much quicker way. Or once that incident's ongoing, is there anything that we could have done to essentially use the SOC's capabilities alongside the supply chain team's kind of data and knowledge to be able to kind of recover from that incident faster? So it was a bit of a thought experiment. I don't know any companies that have done this very well and that have spent a lot of time getting their security operations centers and supply chain teams working together. So the idea was that we would essentially run through a hypothetical breach and then try and basically have a think about what we could have done to better get the SOC and the supply chain teams working together. It's meant to be a bit of a greenfield in terms of the ideas that we're coming up with. So again, it wasn't meant to be a webinar. If anyone on the call has any ideas as we're going through and would like to put those in the comments, like feel free. But yeah, I think once Natasha potentially has the slides, we'll be able to jump into the hypothetical scenario. I think it might have been the timing cycling the first four slides. I assume have probably gone to all of the slides.
Yes, every slide has decided that it's going to jump right on ahead. So
Worst
I
case, we can
hope
leave it on
I
this.
hope I fixed it. Otherwise, it would be a very short webinar if you followed the timing of the slides.
Not at all.
Let's see.
Cool. So to kick things off in this hypothetical scenario, the idea is that it's a late Friday afternoon, and you start to receive complaints from your customers that one of your applications can't be accessed. So one of your critical suppliers, supplier A, basically informs you that they've had some sort of incident, and that their service is now offline. And that supplier, supplier A, actually runs identity and access management for your production application. So the identity system is completely down. Customers can't log in. And luckily, you have thought through this scenario before, and you actually do have an incident plan in place. So you immediately switch to incident mode, and you invoke a backup supplier that you had ready to go. So you reconfigure your application to connect to them and essentially make the switch. Hopefully, this hypothetical scenario isn't resonating too much with the people on the call. So since you've invoked an incident, questions start kind of flowing through, particularly from senior leadership and from your customers. So some of those questions may be, is this breach actually going to impact any of our customer data? Is our environment safe, or do we need to kind of start looking at our own environment to check whether or not we've been breached? Do we need to notify anyone? So any regulators or any clients to tell them that our services are potentially impacted? Do we have a mitigation plan? So now that we know that we've invoked and switched the supplier to a backup supplier, is there anything else we need to do to make sure that the service is stable and up and running? How do we get our app working again, which is linked to that? So it's once you've kind of switched that supplier, is there anything else you need to do to make sure that the app is operating effectively? And then the final one was around, I'm waiting for the slider. The final one was around how are we so unaware of the risk? This is more kind of a later stage question, but it would be how were we caught out essentially by this? And is there anything we could have been doing better with the supplier to ensure that this breach did not happen, essentially?
And actually, Hayden, we've got someone on the call who's phoned me up to ask me specifically when they had third party let them know that they'd been breached, quickly asking, what's our exposure?
Yeah.
What can they see in our environment? What can they get to? Is there any risk? Can we have a look at that a bit more closely? So yeah, very, very relevant questions that come through, and you have to be able to answer them quite quickly.
Yeah, and we'll touch on this a little bit later, but oftentimes we find that at this point it's kind of you know that something has happened and you know that it's potentially a security incident because the supplier has told you, but you often don't have much more information than that. So you don't really understand kind of what's gone on, whether the incident was more of an availability one or kind of a data loss one. So oftentimes these questions are flooding in and people are demanding answers when you don't have the full kind of picture in front of you to be able to respond to it. But in a bit of a twist, the backup supplier that you have failed over to also fails. So you don't hear anything for kind of the next hour or two, and then suddenly you get an email from the backup supplier saying that their systems are completely down as well. And at this point, kind of true panic sets in. You had a plan. That plan has now been thrown out the window, and your backup supplier is unable to continue the proper functioning of your application. So what's happened? Now, the idea here is that if we go on to the next slide, I've worked on quite a few breaches where you essentially have a breach that's further down the supply chain that can impact multiple of your suppliers. And that's what's happened in this case. There was a critical fourth party to both the primary supplier providing the identity service to your application, but also the backup supplier that you had planned to fail over to. A vulnerability was exploited and it essentially brought that fourth party offline, which then impacted both supplier A and backup supplier B and their ability to provide their services. And this is kind of a key point here. So I think supply chain teams are very much focused on trying to understand the risk of a single supplier that they work with. And they've not really thought about the supply chain as like a holistic system of relationships. And if we're to really try and understand the risk of a supplier ecosystem, we need to understand kind of what that ecosystem looks like, essentially.
I think the other key thing there is it changes quite dynamically. I know we do a lot of third-party risk assessments where there's a particular question inside of Risk Ledger that asks, do you make sure that when you're engaging a new sub-process of the data, that you're going to let your clients know and possibly even seek approval before? And a lot of them answer with, well, here's a link to our website where we're always posting our latest sub processes. And if there's anyone there that you're worried about, let us know, raise an objection at that point. So it kind of happens that they're engaging new sub processes and new technology providers all the time without you knowing about it. And unless you're actively tracking and managing these things, it changes very dynamically.
So if we move on to the next slide, so oftentimes when kind of I talk about either the real stories that I've been through here or hypothetical scenarios, I get asked kind of how likely actually is this? And the image on the screen in front of you is actually a visualization of a supplier ecosystem for a large financial services firm. And the idea here is that each dot on that kind of spider diagram is essentially a company, and the lines between them are who's working with who. And the blue circles within that visualization are where you have a supplier that has multiple critical connections to other suppliers around them. And you can see there's about 89 of those blue circles. And essentially, what I'm trying to portray with this slide is that these scenarios are a lot more likely than people think. So I've had it a few times where a fourth party has been hit, and then the client that I'm working with as a consultant essentially had multiple third parties lose their service all at the same time, which essentially magnifies that impact. But then that leads us on to the next question. So in that hypothetical scenario so far, we essentially have a risk team who is very much focused on assuring individual suppliers. And then we have a security operations center team whose capability is mostly geared towards monitoring and responding to things that are happening internally within the client. So the interesting thought experiment was, well, is there anything that we could do to essentially allow the supply chain team to collect data that would be useful to the security operations center? And anything that we could do to extend that security operations center's capability further into the supply chain? And if we were able to do that, what would be the outcome? So what would be the things that would be looking to essentially improve? And Andy and I came up with these kind of few almost aims of what we would be trying to achieve by doing that. So the first one would be kind of, it would be great to have more proactive rather than reactive alerts. So in the scenario that we just ran through, the idea there is that clients are coming to us saying their application's down and we're already on the back foot trying to respond to that. Incidents are always managed a lot better in a much more calm fashion when kind of we're ahead of that and we understand what's gone on and we understand the impact of it so that we can actually communicate better, both with senior management and people who may be using the system or service that's down. Which then leads on to the second point, which is a quicker, essentially, understanding of an incident's impact. So the quicker we can understand an incident, the quicker we can make sure that our communications about the incident are correct and confident, and then that usually leads to greater confidence with our clients and with the board and even with regulators as well. Uh, that then leads on to the third one, which is quicker and more confident communications. So oftentimes I see it doesn't actually really matter how damaging the incident is, especially if it's an availability one. If an application is going to go down, the application will go down. And I often find that clients can be fairly forgiving in terms of how quickly it takes you to stand the application up, as long as you're able to communicate how long that will be. So what I mean by that is that if you have an application that's gone down and you're telling clients it'll be stood up within an hour, and then 8 hours later it's still not stood back up, that looks a lot worse than if you're able to say, look, the application's gone down, but it'll be stood up within 8 hours. And I usually find that the accuracy of the communications is quite a critical thing in terms of building that confidence and making sure that we're not losing face in front of our clients. And then the final aim was essentially, is there a way that we could offer better support for suppliers' incident response processes by extending that capability from our SOC into the supply chain was the idea. But yeah, in terms of doing that, then we kind of ran through what would have to happen in order to achieve those aims. And this first slide covers mostly kind of the supply chain risk team and what they could be doing to collect better data and feed that through to the Security Operations Center. So ideally, they would have a view that's a little bit deeper than the third parties they work with. So a lot of organizations that we speak to now, they run a third-party assurance process, but they're then trying to extend that down to the fourth-party layer to try and understand what their exposure is to common critical fourth parties. Even if they can't do this broadly across their supply chain, what they're doing is they're looking at their third parties, they're trying to identify which of their third parties are the most critical, and then they're trying to do the fourth-party analysis of those third parties. That data essentially would allow you to identify where these single points of failure are within the supply chain and where you may have exposure where one incident can actually cause multiple other companies to come offline and essentially magnify that impact against you. This is typically done either through kind of asking your suppliers or building up a relationship and asking them, or you can also do it through tracking things like sub-processors within terms of service. Or you can do it through kind of community-driven assurance platforms like Risk Ledger. But Andy, alongside this, came up with an idea where the SOC could also better track this.
Well, yeah, I just it's something that we're already doing for customers based on our knowledge of their environment and their technology stack. We're subscribing to the various technology sort of RSS alerting feeds that whenever there's a new 0 day or a new patch, we're on top of it and able to let customers know, well, this is something that we've seen that's being exploited in the wild. This is something that you need to look at. Now, that workflow already exists for customers and their own technology stacks. And it's simply a matter of adding more suppliers and more technologies into that workflow to be able to track those things. But if we don't know about them and we don't know about the third and the fourth party critical suppliers and technologies, we can't add them into that workflow. But ideally, you would get a signal or a warning, and we talk about this in one of the later slides, that actually something that you are dependent on is being exploited in the wild, and you do need to check whether that thing has been patched quite urgently. That's either through talking to the supplier directly, or if it's within your own control, patching it yourself.
Yeah. In order to do that, it relies on that supply chain team having kind of a really solid data set for the SOC to be able to work off. And that data set oftentimes actually relies on procurement as well. So it's knowing who your suppliers are, what they're doing for you, being able to categorize them in a meaningful way. So which of those suppliers pose an availability risk, which pose a data security risk, and then being able to extend that knowledge down into that fourth party layer as well. Um, but yeah, the next kind of idea was essentially extending the SOC's capability further into the supply chain. So Andy, I'm going to be relying on you here to back up my points. But the idea essentially was that if you have a portfolio of suppliers, some of those suppliers will pose an availability risk and others will pose a data confidentiality risk. And some may also integrate their systems into yours. And once you understand kind of the risks that these suppliers pose you, for suppliers that are posing a large or a kind of a critical inherent risk, is there a way that we can extend the SOC's visibility into what they're doing so that we can actually alert a bit more proactively rather than reactively?
Well,
So
yeah, I mean, I gave the example of the vulnerability management as being one kind of monitoring, but also understanding regarding that question that I got from one of the CISOs when their third party was breached. What can they access in our environment? You know, what identities do they have? What privileges? What permissions? So keeping an inventory of that at hand to know how you can quickly contain that to block off that access is a key part of the monitoring. Looking at the attack surface of the suppliers themselves, which goes beyond just vulnerabilities. It could be open ports, the way that they've configured their email. And I know, Hayden, that actually this is a growing area within Risk Ledger itself to do some of this automated attack surface management monitoring, which I think I'll give you an opportunity just to chat about now as well. But the last point I had on there was also threat intelligence, going into parts of the internet, like the dark web, for example, to try and spot lost or leaked credentials of suppliers, which makes it really easy for hackers to breach them because they don't hack in, they simply log in with those trusted credentials. Now, if they can log into the supplier and that supplier then has access within your environment, they simply follow that chain and log straight into your own environment to impact you. So yeah, just coming back to the attack surface management, Hayden, maybe you've got a few points there.
yeah, I mean the kind of the key thing around attack surface management type stuff in the supply chain is that I think what muddies it or what makes it quite challenging is the relationships between companies. So in the past, we've seen, for example, a lot of providers provide paying clients a view of kind of the attack surface of their suppliers, but then that leaves the client with some sort of report that they have to go to the suppliers and kind of try and strong arm them into either fixing things and assuming the report's correct, or getting the supplier to say why the report's full of false positives or whatever it might be that it's incorrect. Kind of our view of this is that we should be providing security services to suppliers in a way that's easy for them to consume, but ultimately gives them the responsibility and control over what they do with it. So the idea behind what we do is that we provide a free Excel attack surface management tool to all the suppliers on our platform. They can then use that data for free to fix problems, to identify kind of the configuration of certain kind of public IP address type things. And then we can give that telemetry of either what the supplier is saying is not a problem or the things the supplier has improved back to the client to show that improvement over time is the idea. Um, but yeah,
We've
even
built
just
an integration, interestingly, there, Hayden, between Risk Ledger and the SOC, so that when there are changes in the compliance score, those come through as alerts into the SOC for the team to triage. So those sort of real-time changes in environment and configuration are also really key in the SOC being proactive about changes in the supplier's security posture.
yeah, we've also seen interestingly where there are security operations centers looking after multiple companies. We have seen companies that then use Risk Ledger providing the supply chain data to that SOC so that they can see what other clients may be exposed to supplier breaches that are being reported by one client, which is quite an interesting use case as well. In highly federated organizations where you might have like one central security operations center looking after a load of sub-entities within the organization, it basically helps them be a lot more proactive at, well, something bad has happened here. And we know it's impacted this sub-entity, but who else do we now need to go and talk to who it may have impacted as well? And it's essentially using that supply chain data to better understand the blast radius of different incidents that are occurring.
The last point that I've added to this slide was just around a particular story where a financial services customer of ours had a third-party supplier who was looking after some of their data. It turns out that they'd lost some of that data in a breach and they'd kicked off their incident response plan. And as part of that plan, had notified our customer. And what was really interesting about this case was the supplier didn't know the incident response plan of our customer and who to call, how to invoke that. When the teams did come online, they didn't know how to interact with each other. as sort of a combined incident response team, who the escalation contacts were, or even what the SLAs were coming back with information. Now, because the third party wasn't a financial services provider, they didn't have any reporting requirements. But because it was a financial services company whose data they'd lost, they did have some regulatory requirements around reporting deadlines. And this was particularly in Singapore, where they probably have one of the strictest reporting timelines of all the financial regulators. And because these things weren't aligned, there was a lot of pressure and stress to make sure that the reporting could happen in time. And getting these two incident response teams to work together was a bit of a challenge because they'd never done it before. They hadn't spent the time to understand the process or each other's processes. And so a lot of time was wasted just trying to get those things to align. And then a bit of a question here, and maybe people can put some comments into the chat, and we can pick them up at the end. But how far do you go as a customer of these supplier services, and one of your suppliers is then breached, and it may have an impact on yourself? How far do you go in supporting your supplier's incident response? I think it differs from industry to industry, the risk, your capability, the resources available. So it would be interesting to hear what some of the people on the call are thinking.
Yeah, I think there's also a really important point around the collaboration between kind of different security teams. One of the big things that we used to do when I was working supply chain essentially was once you have understood the breadth of your supplier risk, so your third parties and hopefully some of the fourth parties as well, you would identify kind of which of those suppliers would be the most impactful if they were to have an incident. And then the idea was that you would try and build a relationship with their security team so that they understood kind of like who you were and you could pick up the phone and actually talk to them if something were to go wrong. And then the next evolution and maturity of that was actually running tabletop exercises to simulate some sort of attack or breach, so that you kind of got experience of working with each other as well.
Yeah, I don't know how many, I certainly haven't seen it too often where suppliers run combined incident response exercises.
I've seen it. I've seen it more so now in banking and financial services. They're starting to do it a bit more, and
Right.
government as well. But yeah, it's definitely something that 10 years ago I didn't see happen at all, and it's kind of started to pick up, which is quite nice.
Yeah.
Third thing is back on the supply chain team. So the idea here is that the supply chain team, if they had understood that their backup supplier was exposed to the same critical fourth party that their primary supplier was, then ideally they could remove that dependency. So that would be either switching to a different backup supplier or getting that backup supplier to change fourth party provider. That essentially would move that single point of failure out of the supply chain, which increases the chances that if that primary supplier does have an incident, then the failover to the backup supplier would work, and that you would be able to stand the application up very quickly. This can often be quite hard to do, because either you're having to influence another company's use of suppliers, which inherently can be quite difficult, or you're having to try and persuade the business or commercial to move to a different backup provider, which again can come with kind of additional costs and additional work that sometimes other teams within the business don't really buy into. But if you're able to do that, that would almost completely remove that exposure. And then the final thing would be if you can't eradicate it. This was another kind of discussion Andy and I had. When I have done work within disaster recovery and business continuity, we always spoke about kind of disaster recovery sites, for example, and how you might have a hot disaster recovery site, which is one that's ready to go, where you can fail over to it. And then you might have colder disaster recovery sites where they're not ready to go, but they are there and they'll take a little bit of time to stand up, but at least you have them there, and you can begin that process of standing them up if you need to. And the idea essentially was, can we steal a few of these kind of ideas and then apply them to the supply chain? So if you can't kind of remove that fourth party exposure, could we create some sort of layered approach where you do have a third supplier that you don't necessarily yet have a contract with, but you do know who they are, and you do know that you can switch your application over to them, and you do have a phone number there ready to call in case that backup supplier B does go offline during an incident as well. And then alongside this, it was basically involving the Security Operations Center team in a lot of this threat modeling. So one of the things that I have not seen done as often as I would like is where the supply chain has started to really understand or the supply chain team have started to really understand the risk that different suppliers have posed to them. Can they sit down with the cyber team and essentially start to run through scenarios where an incident were to happen in the supply chain and kind of run through the thought process of what would happen off the back of that? And that can be quite powerful in terms of exercising those muscles in terms of what you would do if the incident were to occur.
We're being asked more and more often now, Hayden, to assist customers with their third-party risk management programs because they can't translate those technical control deficiencies into an actual story. And the
Yeah.
business who have to make the decisions around whether to use the supplier or not have no idea what it means if MFA isn't available on a particular remote service. But quite often, control on its own is not enough. You have to layer these things to come up with the real threat story of this is the bad stuff that could happen. And when you tell that story to the business person that owns the relationship with the supplier, they really get it. So, we've had to, in the SOC, be able to translate really technical things to the business so that they can understand them. And I think that's also translated well in third-party risk management. And it's just made it a more powerful tool where you actually know you've got something to deal with now, something that is you can have a conversation with the supplier and they can go and fix these things to avoid that particular scenario. Or it's something that the business owner will just simply accept and say, look, they're the only supplier that can do this thing. We really want to use them, and regardless of the risk, we're gonna go ahead. But that moves the onus of taking on that risk away from the IT department where third-party risk management has traditionally sat back to the business. The business own the risk of doing business with their suppliers. And this is what Risk Ledger and that process, that service wrapper that we've put around it, has helped to achieve for many of our customers.
Yeah, and the other thing to mention here is that it's not about doing this with every supplier either. It's about identifying where those biggest risks are and really focusing in on those biggest risks and trying to figure out, well, how would that risk materialize? What would that actually look like in a real life scenario? So if I think of like we've had clients in healthcare where they have had breaches at suppliers who are providing healthcare products to hospitals, which has actually led to, for example, like a threat to life and people not being able to get the service
Goodness.
they need. Yeah, so it's about really identifying kind of who are those suppliers that support those critical processes, and then doubling down on, okay, well, if something were to go wrong there, what actually would that look like? And what could we do to either reduce the impact if it were to happen, or just completely remove the likelihood of it happening in the first place? But yeah. So if we were able to do all of those things, the idea was if we replay that hypothetical scenario, what would have changed? So Andy and I quickly ran through this again, and the idea was that the first change would be you would receive an alert from the Security Operations Center that supplier A's cloud provider had a vulnerability that was exploited. You would understand very quickly that actually there's a high likelihood that your identity provider, supplier A, will be impacted. And you can really kind of understand actually, okay, well, straight away that's an availability risk. It's not necessarily a data confidentiality one. The SOC would be able to track the availability of the suppliers that you work with a lot closer. That can basically be using things like Down Detector or even now integrating with APIs that technology companies have showing whether or not their services are up and running. And if you were doing that kind of monitoring across both supplier A and the backup supplier B, you would be able to see fairly quickly that both had gone offline and you're not invoking kind of a changeover to a backup supplier and then waiting to see if it works. You would know straight away that that's not a viable plan. That essentially would lead to your ability to invoke an incident a lot sooner and to start kind of containing that incident. And then it would kind of come down to, well, has your supply chain team got another backup provider that they can fail over to? Or if not, it basically allows you to sharpen up your communication with your clients and with your board and give them actual accurate information on the incident, what's going on, what your exposure is to it, and how long it's going to take to remediate and kind of overcome. But yeah, it essentially would lead to a lot more of a proactive incident response process with a lot more clear communication and hopefully a lot less panic as well, is the idea. Do you want to hand over to Andy for the
Yeah, I think it's always, after you share a really scary story, and talk about things that people can do to improve. What can people take away from this session today? What can they start doing immediately? And your point earlier about you wouldn't do this for all of your suppliers is probably the most important first step in rolling out a third-party risk management program. Who are your suppliers and who are your critical suppliers? Understanding that is point number one. Now, actually, it's not a trivial thing to do. It's a bit of a process, and we have developed a nice guide that helps customers, get to grips with that fairly quickly. There's a set of questions that you can ask to quickly prioritize who your critical suppliers are. And that's in this supplier tiering guide. I think there's a QR code that's going to come after this. So if you are interested in that, you can grab that. And basically that spits out a list of, maybe 5 or even 10 critical suppliers. And as a step two, and I think this is a really fantastic offering from Risk Ledger, there's a trial version, and you get to load 5 suppliers into the trial version. So why not put those 5 critical suppliers in there? There's a high likelihood that they've already got a profile in the platform, so you can just simply review the answers that they've put in there. And if not, you can send them a request through the platform to get their details added. But then, there's 2 types of assessment framework on there. There's a very lightweight one, and then there's also a heavy one. And you can choose, based on your requirements, which ones you want to perform. But, the tools are available for you to start running through this, and you can get an idea of how much time and effort it takes to perform this. And at least for your 5 critical suppliers, you can say you've been through this process and you've got some level of risk. And that's step three. Those valuable risks that come out of understanding those technical control deficiencies. Um, how do you translate that into what that means for the business? And how do you hand those risks back to the business so that they can do something with it? They're the ones with the supplier relationships, which means they can put the pressure to either get these things remediated, or if they really are desperate to work with these suppliers, they're going to have to manage it. But ultimately, it's their risk. So I think, three, they're not going to cost you any money tasks, but they are going to cost you some time to go through it. And hopefully, with the resources that we've prepared for you, your time to getting there is going to be a lot less. You're not going to have to think about it. You just have to follow the process. Natasha, do you want to close up for us? Just a quick summary. Thank you very much. Q&A. Don't know if we've had any questions as we.
Sure, absolutely. I'm just looking in the Q&A now. We don't have any open questions that have been submitted from the audience. So I think we're just 1 minute over as well. But as Andy said, there are a few resources that are available to you. So Risk Ledger's fantastic free trial, which we would encourage you to sign up for, as well as our own supplier tiering guide as well, which does aim to simplify what can be quite a complicated process. So please do take advantage of those. If you have any questions, comments, post webinar, then please do get in touch. We'll be sending an email out with the recording and a few links to those useful resources as well. But yes, all that remains is to apologise for the haywire slides at the beginning, to thank Andy and Haydn for their kind of expertise and the guidance that they've given throughout, and to wish everyone a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
Thank you
Ethan.
for dealing with the slides, Natasha.